During these last, well, several weeks now, I've really been uh, looking at the life of Daniel and thinking about the life of Daniel. And of course, as we came into the Daniel fast, there was a lot of reason that was the fast that we were looking at in this 21 days that we're in right now. And just want to just simply say, if you've not joined us in that fast, if you haven't begun, it's not too late. We encourage you to do it. If you have your own decision about how you fast, that's fine as well. And we're certainly want to leave that between you and the Lord. But as Pastor Bill said the other night, we just want to make a commitment to what we are going to do, and what we commit to, we do it. And I think that's an important part of what the fast is. And so, but this Daniel fast, we hope more people can, maybe who haven't experienced the fasting before, can begin that in their spiritual life, because it brings great power and great insight and revelation. And God does remarkable things when we fast and pray. And so a part of that was that, in looking at the life of Daniel, was that, that in that season of looking towards this fast, I began to read the book of Daniel. Daniel's only 12 chapters. You can read the entire book probably in less than an hour. Almost anyone could, or listen to it on audio tape. It's not that lengthy, but a lot of interesting things. There's a lot of powerful things about what God does and the way he does things. There's a lot of prophecy and prophetic things contained in some of the parts of Daniel. But Daniel, we want to talk about today, is a man who was a man I believe wanted more of God. And I talked last week about how I want more and how we can have more and how we should want more in our lives. But Daniel was a man I know that wanted more of God, because he was a man of God and he sought God. But he lived in a time of great adversity, Daniel did. He was in a time where Jerusalem had been looted and destroyed by the armies of King Nebuchadnezzar. Many people were murdered and killed, and it was a terrible time. And the Israelites that were deemed useful to the Babylonians or the Chaldean Empire, those that were deemed useful were brought from Jerusalem to Babylon in exile to there. So now the Babylonians, they as a group, a people group, wanted nothing to do with God. They didn't have any interest in it, didn't know anything about it. And in fact, the faith of the Israelites were in their minds mocked and scorned, and they were thought of as lesser, lower than them kind of thing. Because the Babylonians, those people in that time, they worshiped idols, piety in the way that they lived their lives, godless in every way. But now Daniel and 3 other young Hebrew men that came over in that movement from Jerusalem to Babylon, they were selected because of their gifts and talents and their appearance and a lot of things. These young men were selected to be put into a program to be developed, that they could then be in the service of the king at some future date. It was like a 3-year development program that they were going to be in. And during this season, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And this dream that he had, he didn't know what it meant, and it bothered him a great deal. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar went to his group of people, his magicians, his enchanters, sorcerers, astrologers, the scripture says. You know what we're talking about, those kind of people there that are sort of in all of this darkness of the things that they practice. He wanted them to interpret the dream. And so they came to him and said, look, we can't interpret this dream. He didn't just want them to interpret it. He wanted them to tell him what the dream was. He wasn't going to tell them what the dream and then have them interpret it. He was saying, if you're so smart, if you're so great, you should already know what the dream is. Well, they didn't, of course. And they couldn't have interpreted it if they did know it. But the point is, that's what was going on. And Nebuchadnezzar asked them over and over and over again, got so frustrated and angry with the whole thing that he said, I'm going to execute all of them. Now think about working for a guy like that. I mean, he's just said, off with their heads, basically. We're putting them to death. Now, swept up in that group were Daniel and these other 3 Hebrew men, young men that were in this group. So the group that was going to execute them came to get them, and Daniel asked them if he could see the king. Then the king allowed that, and so he came to the king. He said, would you just give me a little bit more time? And so the king, wanting this dream interpreted, said, well, I guess what have I got to lose? So he'll give him a few more moments, time to do that. So that time was granted, and then Daniel went to his other 3 Hebrew the men that had come with him, I'll tell you who they are. You probably recognize them. The names that they were changed to were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Ever heard of them? All right, so that's in Daniel too, by the way, the book of Daniel. Won't be talking about that today, but that's his little group, right, of these Hebrew, these Jewish, these Israelites that were in this program being developed for service to the king. So he went to them and said, we need to pray that God will reveal this dream so that I can go back and tell King Nebuchadnezzar. So they prayed, and then God did that. He honored and answered the prayer. They were given the dream, not only the dream, but the interpretation. So Daniel was able to go back and say, here's what you dreamed, even though you didn't tell me, and here's what the interpretation of that dream is. Now let's look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 47. I'm going to be working through a few verses in different places in Daniel today, but this is what it says here. The king said to Daniel, this is after he told them the dream, and then the dream was interpreted, and it was all correct, and then so he had trust in the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar did. And so the king said to Daniel, truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret. Then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. Now, Babylon was the key city in the Chaldean Empire. He made him the person over that, and then over all of these other wise men and people that they were developing to serve in the king's court. That's what happened to Daniel because he was able to interpret that dream, because God was able to do that. And then Nebuchadnezzar recognized it. So after all of those miraculous events about how that was interpreted, he was going to kill everybody. And then he even said, your God is the greatest of gods. Your God is a God or a Lord over kings. That's what Nebuchadnezzar said. But then guess what? Pride crept in. You ever been proud about something and it messed you up a little bit? Have you ever heard pride cometh before a fall? Well, Nebuchadnezzar was about to learn that lesson. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that today. You can read it in a very short period of time. First, say 3 chapters of Daniel, this story, first couple really. But if you look at that, you'll see what happens to him. But his pride rose up. Even though he said, your God is a God above gods. Your God is the Lord over kings. But no, pride came in, and then look what he did. This is Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This false god that he built, this gold statue, was because of his pride. That's why he did it. And he put it in a place of prominence, in a significant place in Babylon, so that people would all see it and know where it was, and he demanded that it be worshiped. It wasn't an option. It wasn't like, well, here's something that you can worship if you want to. He demanded that it be worshiped. I think we had a photo of that. Do we have a picture of that idol or whatever it was called? Yeah, this isn't a very good photo. They didn't have good cameras back then. But you can see it was this place that was in prominence, and this huge thing that he had built because of his pride. So now, in this environment, this adverse environment that Daniel was living in, there was no love for God. There was no love or any kind of consideration for the God of Daniel. So he lived in a time of adversity, without question, but also he lived in a time of great danger and peril, Daniel did. This is Daniel chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. This is what the king now, when I said he demanded that it be worshiped, not optional, he demanded it be worshiped, and he demanded it in a certain way, and this is what it says in that passage. When you hear the sound of musical instruments, and some translations outline like what a lot of those instruments are, you bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. So now picture your life now. If you're walking around and we're out in our city and we're in our normal lives, and then all of a sudden you hear the music play. It's like musical chairs. At that point, you got to drop down. Now listen, this is what it is. This is what they did. You had to, right then when you heard the music, you had to drop down and bow to that statue and worship that false god. That's what you had to do. And if you didn't, look what happens. It's up there already. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a fiery furnace, a blazing furnace. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Not getting into that today. They wouldn't bow. We know that story. So Nebuchadnezzar decreed that anyone that failed to do it on demand when he said so, whenever they wanted to, would be put to death. That's the world and the culture Daniel lived in. That's the environment that was around him. It was adversity and it was perilous. It was dangerous. But yet through all of this, through all of these things, being exiled from his home in Jerusalem and all the terrible things that happened there and him coming there and all of this wickedness and all these things that were going on all around him, Daniel remained faithful. Daniel remained obedient. Those are two critical things in the life of Daniel. That's what he did. And part of his faithfulness, Daniel's, was an unwavering commitment to prayer. It doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you why in a minute, the unwavering commitment. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Nebuchadnezzar, if you read in the book of Daniel, God removes him from power because of his arrogance, his pride, and everything else. He removed him, and then there's a story of redemption for Nebuchadnezzar. But again, all of that you can look at later. So now, in the timeline of history, there was another king in between, and then there's King Darius. Okay? So King Darius comes on the scene. He's replaced Nebuchadnezzar, and there's a group of people who envy and have great disdain for Daniel. Have you ever had that in a place where people for some reason just get jealous of you or envious of you or what your position is at work or something that's going on or whatever it is, and they just want to turn against you? Have you ever heard of that or had anything like that happen? I mean, I have a few times, and I got to tell you, it is something that people can really take some real hard shots at you. They can stab you in the back. They smile to your face and stab you in the back. It's crazy. But these guys here, what they wanted to do is they wanted to bring Daniel down. Some political leaders and people that were around King Darius, they convinced him into signing a new law. That's what they convinced him to do. And this law was specifically designed to bring down Daniel. This is Daniel chapter 6, verse 7. We are all in agreement. We administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders for the next 30 days. Any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown in the den of lions. Now, what that's saying is that they're saying to King Darius, this law that he signed, anybody that prays to anything but you gets thrown in the den of lions. Do you know that Daniel didn't do that? Right? He got thrown in the den of lions. That's not what this is about today, but you know it. But Daniel was committed to prayer. He was committed to being faithful. He was committed to being obedient, walking in obedience with his God, even though he was living in adverse times, even though he was living in even perilous and dangerous times. He was committed to prayer even to the point of being threatened with his death. That's what Daniel did. Daniel 6:10 says this: when Daniel knew that the document, this law that King Darius had signed, when he knew that had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in the upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So what that tells us is that Daniel did this all the time. It wasn't a one day he came in and prayed 3 times a day. So he prayed 3 times a day, every day. Probably, my guessing is it was on some kind of discipline schedule. It doesn't say in the scripture, but it's probably morning, noon, and night or something. I'm sure it wasn't just like, okay, today at some point I'm going to do these 3 times of prayer. So Daniel had a time and a place. And there's some things in that verse 10, just that one verse. Could we just leave that up there for a moment, verse 10? Thank you. There's some important things that we can learn about Daniel's remarkable prayer life in this scripture. The first thing that we see is that Daniel had a place of prayer, a specific place. In fact, it was an upper chamber of some kind. It was up above the ground. It had windows, and there was a place. That was Daniel's war room. How many people saw the movie War Room? If you haven't, you're going to have a chance to see it here really soon. That's our next movie night coming up. We'll talk about it later. We've had that movie at a movie night previously, and in our team meeting the other day, everybody just said, we need to play that movie again. It's so great, and it's about prayer and all of these things that we're kind of in this season right now, so that's great. You'll hear about that later. But Daniel had a war room. And the other thing that Daniel had is he had a prayer posture. If you look at that, he was on his knees. Now, I want to just tell you, you don't have to, when you pray, you don't have to be on your knees. There's some people that's very hard for them to do that for health reasons and other things. But the point is, Daniel had a prayer posture. Even if you can't be on your knees for those reasons, you can still assume a prayer posture. Are you with me? You understand what I'm saying? Now, it doesn't mean that that's a requirement to pray. It's just another element of the discipline in your prayer to assume a prayer posture. Now, I do think there are times, for those that can do it, that there are times of prayer that you need to be on your knees. Don't get me wrong now. I'm not saying don't do that. I do that. But I don't have to be on my knees to pray. So I can pray, but then there are times, and so what Daniel had, the thing we're learning here in this verse 10, is that he had a place to pray, a specific place that he prayed, and a war room, if you will. And then he had a prayer posture. And then we see the routine and the repetition and the discipline of Daniel's prayer 3 times a day. How many of you, by all standing up, pray 3 times a day? Oh, I'm sorry. Everybody's just looking at me. I don't know many people that do that. I'm not saying just short prayers and prayer without ceasing, and that's great. We should do that. But I'm talking about a time where we say, this morning, this is my time for prayer, and now whatever other time is my time for prayer, and this time is my time for prayer, where I'm going into a place, I'm assuming a prayer posture, I'm in a moment of prayer 3 times a day. This is a man that was dedicated and committed to prayer. So you see that routine, that discipline that he had. And then the last thing you can see here in this verse 10 is that Daniel had a purpose in his prayer. Daniel's purpose in his prayer was a lot of things, and that was to give thanks, is what the verse said. He goes into this place, he got down on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Now, I don't know about you, but when I begin to pray, sometimes I'm trying to think, what am I going to pray? What am I going to say? How do I get started? Here's the thing that I think is the best prayer starter. I think it should be a prayer starter for everybody that begins to pray. The first thing you need to do is be in thanks. Thank you, God, and just start rattling off whatever comes into your spirit, because there's a bunch of it. If you really know that God's moving and working in your life, I can thank him and not do anything else but just thank him in prayer. Thank you for everything. And I do, and I know it maybe sound a little weird, but I'm going to say it anyway. I've maybe said it before. I thank God for air conditioning. I do. Because I consider that to be something that's a blessing. It's a privilege, not a right. You don't have a right to air conditioning. There may be some people in here right now that don't have any. I don't know. But what I'm telling you is, and I'm not just the trivial things, but I'm saying I take the little things and the great things. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for delivering me from alcohol and drugs. Thank you for the power of God working in my life. Thank you for my family. Thank you for all of these things, wonderful things. Thank you for what God's doing in our church. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But the thing is, start with thanks. And boy, that'll get you started praying, man. It's the best prayer starter there is. And that's what Daniel did. We see he had a purpose, and one of those things was giving thanks. So now as these guys planned, this government officials, whatever they were, they catch Daniel praying, because he did it every day, 3 times a day, and they knew that. They catch him praying. So what do? They get him. They go back to King Darius. Even though King Darius was conflicted, you'll see in the scripture, he didn't really want to do it, but he had to, because he felt like he had to, because he had to sign the law, and so they pushed him and bullied him probably into doing it. And he even told Daniel, I hope your God delivers you. And King Darius was restless, and the night before, even many people think he was even fasting in some form for Daniel when they put him in the lion's den, and of course we know God delivered him. So Daniel, this is the world he's living in. This is what I'm trying to set up here. He's living in this time of great adversity and extreme danger all around him. Daniel was also, here's the other thing, he was living under the weight of what God had called him to do. Do you know that when God calls you to do something, sometimes there's a weight that you carry with that? There's a burden. There's some things that God, it's not just all smooth sailing. And that's okay, because what happens is he shows up and he helps us through that. But Daniel was carrying the weight of a lot of things. First of all, that the Israelites have been exiled into Babylon, that they're sitting here in this dangerous place, an adverse time, around a culture that hates God and wants nothing to do with God. That's the world that he's having to live in. And he's being given, if you look in the book of Daniel, he's been given these different visions that God is giving him. And a lot of those visions are very harmful, I'll say, to the future. There are things that are very concerning, and so all of those things that Daniel's going through, it's weight on him. He is under the burden of that. He is carrying that along with him because he's the one that God is showing all of these things. But there was a reason for that. So now, Daniel carrying all of this in this society he's living in, he needed an encounter with God. He needed something different to shift, something that he needed to experience from God. Now, so I believe this, and if you look at and if you read the whole context of the entire book of Daniel, you'll see where I'm going with this, that he was battling, Daniel at the time of his life and what he was battling discouragement. Now, just because he was a great prophet, and we look at him today and say, well, he's Daniel in the book. Look, he came out of the lion's den. He was a great man of God. He was a human being. He was living in that place, all of these things I've been telling you about, just the same as if we would have been. Believe me, there were moments of discouragement. Believe me, there were moments of struggle and battles and things that were difficult for him. In fact, I believe that his circumstances that he was in and the weight that he was carrying was a thing that was overwhelming at times. It had to be. There was no way any human being could handle all of that. So there were moments, because again, he was a man. There were moments that he's thinking, well, are my prayers being answered? Over the years and all the time that he's praying, there's times that he's got to be wondering these things. So now we look forward now. We're looking at a time in Daniel's life where because of the weight and all of these things and the environment and all that surrounding, he was in a time of mourning. Now, many scholars believe that was probably from a previous vision. There's some other things that they think. But the point is, in chapter 10 of Daniel now, he was in a time of mourning. And during this time of mourning that he was fasting for 21 days. Now, a lot of this in Daniel, different places where we see him fasting, is where they come to the Daniel fast that we're in now. And it's all sort of written out of that and the way that he fasted. And so he was in a time of mourning. He was fasting, no rich food, no meats. And the thing that sort of has developed into what is known as the Daniel fast, the way he was fasting. Now, he fasted other ways too, but at any rate, the thing I wanted you to know is that that's where he is right now in his life. He's in a time of mourning. He's been fasting for 21 days, and he receives a vision from the Lord. Now, he's received some visions before, but this is another one, and this is a different one. A troubling and concerning vision. Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. He understood, Daniel did, that the vision concerned events certain to happen in the future, times of war and great hardship. These things have been revealed to Daniel. And he was, again, that weight, that just looking at what he had seen, because he knew that was going to happen in the future. It was certain. So now in this new vision that's coming to Daniel, he's on the banks of the Tigris River. By the way, Babylon is modern-day Baghdad. I don't know if any of you knew that, but that's where it is. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers run right through there. Daniel was on the border or the banks of the Tigris River. And this vision came to him and the three other, I believe it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three other Hebrew men that were there with him, but there were three others with him, and what happened was this vision came and they hightailed it out of there because they were so scared. This is the magnitude now of the vision that's being given to Daniel. So, in that time he was left alone, and this is verse 7. So only I, Daniel, saw this vision. Now, I'm not going to read what the vision was at this point. You can later. The men with me saw nothing because they were suddenly terrified and ran away to hide. That's how the magnitude of it. They didn't just run away. They ran away to hide. Whatever was happening was scaring those guys to death. So they bolted out of there. So here it is, just Daniel. So I was left there all alone to see this amazing vision. My strength left me. My face grew deathly pale, and I felt very weak. Then I heard the man in the vision speak. And when I heard the sound of his voice, now he's standing there on the banks of this river now. When I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted and lay there with my face to the ground. Has anybody ever fainted before? I fainted one time in my life, and it was the scariest thing. That I was in a doctor's office, and something was going on. I don't even remember what it was, and I'm standing there, and 1 minute, the next thing I know, I'm looking up, and the doctor's looking over me like this, and I'm saying, what happened? He said, you fainted. I'm like, well, I guess I know what that is now. I didn't faint because, like, some pretty girl went by, and I'm like, or like girls do when guys go by and they go, oh. No, it wasn't that. But fainting is we know what fainting is. He passed out. He passed out and fell face down to the ground. Daniel is in a troubled state. He is under the weight of all of these things that God was showing him and God was doing, and all of the circumstances and environment that he had been living in for all of these years. His strength was gone, it says. Now let's look at verse 10. Oh, let's look at verse 10. Just then, a hand touched me and lifted me, still trembling, to my hands and knees. You see, in the spite of all of that, his strength was gone and he's there. And all the weight that he was carrying, what did Daniel need? He needed a touch. He needed a touch, and he needed someone to lift him up. And that's what he experienced. Even though he was still fearful and he was still under all of this, he experienced that. He needed a touch from God, and he got it. He needed something to lift him up, and he got it. But God wasn't finished with Daniel. He wasn't going to leave him just like that. He wasn't going to let the righteousness of this man go and be forsaken. That's not what God was going to do. Verse 11. And the man said to me, Daniel, you are very precious to God, so listen carefully to what I have to say to you. Stand up, for I have been sent to you. When he said this to me, I stood up, still trembling. Daniel was awestruck about what was going on. The weight of everything he was carrying and all of this world that he was living in and everything that was around him. He was still trembling a little bit, but he had had a touch. He had had a hand help him get up. And then he got up on his hands and knees, and then he stood up. And then verse 12, then he said, this is what Daniel needed. This was the encounter that he needed. He said, don't be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day, say first day. Since the first day you began to pray for understanding and humble yourself before your God, your request has been heard in heaven. I have come in to answer your prayer. Since the first day he prayed, in spite of everything that was going on around him, in spite of being thrown in a lion's den, in spite of all the wickedness and the terrible things that were going on, people trying to come and kill him and connive against him and stab him in the back, and all the weight of the visions and things, everything that Daniel had, it didn't matter, because from the first day you began to pray. The first day, and humble yourself, your request has been heard in heaven. And listen to me today, folks. And then he says, I have come in answer to your prayer. There's some great lessons we can learn in this. So listen, through faithful now, prayer, and some fasting, and the humility of Daniel, there's some great things that we can learn that apply to us today. Here's the thing that we need to know through all of this. God listened to him. And let me tell you something today, for every single one of you sitting in this place today, God is listening to you. God hears you. He is listening to you. And you can be assured of that. Now here's a man who prayed and prayed and prayed 3 times a day. He fasted and prayed. I know there were times that Daniel was wondering, are my prayers being heard? Are they falling on deaf ears? Or is God forgotten about me? Or are my prayers 3 times a day? I'm doing it, yes, Lord, in obedience. But is it all in vain? Did he maybe ever possibly think about, maybe I don't need to pray anymore? I think it's possible that he did. Not do it, but thought about it. Or maybe instead of 3 times a day, I'm going to pray 1 time a day. Because I just don't see something moving. I don't see something happening. Is it worth it? But here's the thing. God shows up right on time. He shows up at the moment when we need it. And like he said to him, I heard you the first time you prayed, Daniel. I heard you then. And your request has been heard in heaven. God was listening to Daniel. and God is listening to you. There are times, listen now, I'm in this season now and have been before and will be again. There are times that God grants your request, but he does not give you that request. Do you hear me? God grants your request. He hears you the first time. It doesn't mean stop praying now. Oh, he heard me the first time, so I don't need to tell him he would know. He heard you. There are times when God is granting our request, but he's not giving it to us yet. That happens. You see, we cannot see with our eye, we can't see what God is doing. But here's the thing. We absolutely know God is doing something. You have to know that. See, that was what was happening with Daniel. He's doing something, and that something that he is doing is the right thing. God is doing the right thing. So, folks, today you may feel God's not heard your prayer. There are people in this room right now I know that have been praying about something and are in prayer about something, and you haven't gotten the answer. You haven't done it, and you're wondering some of the things that maybe Daniel did. You've prayed and prayed. It seems like maybe the lights are on in heaven, but is anyone home? I know that there are people like that, feeling that way, and don't feel bad about feeling that way. I've felt that way. Pastor Bill's felt that way. Other leaders of powerful prayer leaders in our church have felt that way. But just like Daniel, God heard you the first time, and God's waiting for the right time. Believe that. He heard you the first time. He's waiting for the right time. So my encouragement to you today is don't give up. God hears you. He is listening to you. Let your faith be strong today. Let faith rise up. And when you have those moments of discouragement, say, not only am I going to just believe, I'm going to believe stronger and mightier and more dedicated. I'm going to put myself in a place where my faithfulness and my obedience is nothing more than what God wants. And I know he will honor it because he heard me the first time and he's waiting on the right time. Jeremiah 33:3 says this, call to me and I will answer you. Now it says, call to me, right? Didn't say I'm going to answer you. Call to me and I will answer you and tell you and even show you, the Amplified Bible says, great and mighty things, things which have been confined and hidden. So there are some things that God has. He may have granted answers. He may have answered things in the unseen places. He may have done things already on your behalf. He's working. He's answering because he heard you the first time. And what's happening is he is waiting for the right time to reveal that to you. Just like he did with Daniel. He's waiting for the right time. Because God's time is always the right time. So what Daniel learned, and what we can learn today, is that no matter what the world's all around us swirling, the culture, the wickedness, the evil, the sin, the devil, all of these things that are going on all around us, the uncertainty, the weight of the world that we live in and the weight of the things that we're dealing with, our circumstances resting on our shoulders, no matter what that is, just like Daniel learned, we can learn today that all it takes is just one touch. And there's a hand that's going to come down when you're face down, passed out on the ground, and you don't have anything left. No strength, no desire. You just feel like you want to quit. And you're going to feel that touch. And he's going to lift you. And he's going to raise you up. And he's going to say, start there and then stand up. And then as you stand up, what he's going to do is he's going to say, I'm going to be with you because I heard you the first time. I heard you the first time, and now's the right time.